Welcome to Lo-Fi Stories. I'm Anna, your host for tonight's mystery. Before we begin, take a deep breath. Grab a cup of coffee and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight. Let's begin. It began, as many peculiar things in London do, with an unseasonable garment. The summer of 1891 was of the sort that made the city swell and shimmer, a heat that seemed to rise from the cobblestones, filling every alley with an oppressive haze. Londoners, clad in linen and light cotton, moved about with the lethargy of overheated cattle. Therefore, it struck me as unusual when I first glimpsed the minister walking along Whitehall in a coat so thick and dark it seemed almost funereal. I was not alone in noticing. Mycroft Holmes, seated at his corner in the Diogenes Club, had a window that afforded a modest but strategic view of the street below. His eyes, half-lidded and unreadable, had been fixed on the minister for some minutes before I even thought to remark upon it. "But surely," I began, "there is nothing extraordinary about a gentleman preferring his dignity to the season." "Dignity," Mycroft murmured, "is rarely lined with lead shot and stitched with hidden seams." He did not elaborate, but I knew better than to press. Mycroft's silences were like deep wells. You could throw questions into them, but the echo might come back hours later, often in the form of an answer you did not expect. The minister in question was the Right Honourable Cecil Harrogate, a man whose career had been built upon a careful balance of eloquence and evasion. He had presided over matters of the empire's colonial trade with an air of unshakable confidence, but he had also acquired enemies, in Parliament and far beyond it. That morning, Mycroft had been informed through channels he never named that Harrogate was due to present a document of unusual importance at a closed cabinet meeting. "A cipher," Mycroft said finally. "Hidden in plain sight. But where?" The question hung between us like a pall of smoke. The Diogenes Club was the one place in London where conversation was considered almost indecent, so Mycroft rose, adjusted his hat, and gestured for me to follow him into the street. We walked with deliberate pace, shadowing the minister at a comfortable distance. The man's gait was measured, his head inclined slightly forward as though bracing against a wind that did not exist. We followed him past Horse Guards Parade, across the Mall, and into the quieter streets of St. James's. The coat, that infernal coat, swayed with each step, betraying a faint but unmistakable weight. "But if it is a cipher," I said at last, "why conceal it in clothing?" Mycroft's lips curled in the faintest of smiles. "Because, my dear fellow, a coat cannot be intercepted by a courier, nor can it be easily searched without causing a scandal. Therefore, it is the perfect disguise." We lost sight of Harrogate briefly as he entered a gentleman's outfitter's, a place so discreet its windows displayed nothing but a single brass placard with the proprietor's name. When he emerged, the coat was still upon him, but his pace had quickened. "There is a meeting tonight," Mycroft said quietly. "Not in Parliament. Not in any official chamber. And whatever he carries in that coat will decide the course of several governments." The words struck me with a chill that no summer sun could dispel. That evening, Mycroft did not dine at the club as was his custom. Instead, he summoned me to a small book-lined room in Pall Mall, an unofficial office where maps and files lay in careful disorder. The air was thick with the scent of pipe smoke and the faint tang of sealing wax. On the desk lay a thin dossier, Harrogate's recent movements, a list of associates, and, most ominously, a telegram intercepted from an agent in Constantinople. It read only, "Deliver before midnight. The cipher must not fall." "But who is to receive it?" "Yes, that," Mycroft said, "is the question. And we have but hours to find the answer." Night fell heavy over London. The city's lamps flickered to life, throwing pools of amber light into the fog. Mycroft, who rarely left his chosen haunts, now strode with purpose through the dim streets. We took a hansom cab to the east, toward the river, where the great warehouses loomed like sleeping giants. Harrogate was there, standing under the shadow of a warehouse arch, speaking to a figure I could not quite discern. The coat was still buttoned, the collar turned up against the warm air as though guarding something more than the wearer's neck. Mycroft watched intently, his eyes narrowing. "He will make the exchange here," he whispered. "But we are late, therefore we must be bold." He stepped forward, his voice carrying across the cobblestones. "Minister Harrogate, a word if you please." The minister stiffened, turning sharply. His companion, tall, gaunt, with a narrow face, melted into the shadows and was gone before I could so much as blink. Harrogate's voice was sharp. "Mr. Holmes, this is neither the time nor the place." "On the contrary," Mycroft interrupted, "it is precisely the time and place. The cipher in your coat, Minister. You will hand it to me now." For a moment, I thought Harrogate might deny it outright. But his hand twitched toward the coat's inner seam, and in that instant I understood. Mycroft had been right all along. There was something concealed there. Not paper, perhaps, but something else entirely. "But why?" I began. "Not now," Mycroft said. "We must move. Quickly." And thus, with the fog thickening around us and the Thames whispering its eternal secrets nearby, the game began. Chapter 2. The Unfolding Pattern. It is a curious thing about secrets. They rarely rest in silence. They shift, they breathe, they itch against the mind until, at last, they find a way to speak. But some secrets speak not in words, but in symbols. Strange, obstinate symbols that yield nothing to the untrained eye. Therefore, when I received Mycroft Holmes's telegram the following afternoon, I knew the matter had already deepened. The note was brief, as his notes always were. "Ministry archives compromised. Cipher confirmed. Bring discretion. D." The D was his subtle way of indicating urgency. It did not stand for danger, though it might as well have. Meant delicate. A matter so politically fragile that even the movement of one rumor could collapse ministries and shatter alliances. The train to Whitehall felt longer than usual. London was wrapped in a pale winter haze, its skyline reduced to silhouettes, chimneys like watchtowers, rooftops hunched as though listening. My mind wandered to the cipher in the lining of the coat. A curious placement, deliberate in every way. A man might lose a letter. He might drop a map. But to sew a secret into the very clothing one wears, that speaks not merely of concealment, but of possession. I reached the Diogenes Club by noon. Mycroft was waiting in his usual chamber, back straight, eyes heavy-lidded yet impossibly alert. Before him lay the minister's coat, now spread upon a wide oak table like a specimen under study. "You examined it?" "Yes." "I did," Mycroft said without preamble. "And what I found was both expected and deeply troubling." He gestured for me to sit. The cipher, once exposed from its hiding place, was a series of vertical columns, handwritten in a faint, cramped script. To the casual observer they might appear as meaningless numbers. 14, 3, 22, 5, 9. But Mycroft's eyes had that glint I had learned to read well. It meant he had already guessed at its method. "It is a transposition cipher," he murmured. "But there is a refinement, one I have only seen in foreign intelligence." "Foreign?" "Press. Then we are dealing with an outside hand." He shook his head, almost impatiently. "Not so fast. The structure is foreign, yes, but the hand that wrote it is English. I can tell by the formation of the numerals, the peculiar arch of the 7. A Frenchman's 7 is crossed. This is not. I could feel the tension drawing in like a tightening rope. Mycroft slid a second paper toward me, a transcription of the numbers as he had rearranged them. The letters that emerged were not in English, but Latin. Ministerium Noctis, I read aloud. The Ministry of Night. Mycroft's tone was colder than the January air. A fiction. A name used only in covert communications between certain operatives. It does not officially exist, and yet it moves, acts, funds. Whoever sent this cipher is not only trained, but connected to a network that works beneath the government's very feet. A silence settled, heavy and certain. But why hide it in the coat? I asked, still clinging to the practical. Because the minister's coat is never searched, Mycroft replied. He wears it into every room, every negotiation, every dinner. A perfect courier without knowledge of his own burden. The implication struck like a hammer blow. Then the minister has been carrying messages for months, perhaps years, Mycroft finished, without a whisper of suspicion. Which means, I saw the thought pass in his mind before he spoke it. The leak is not from his household staff. It is from within the cabinet itself. I felt the room constrict, as though the very walls leaned in to overhear us. And if this network is real? Yes. Mycroft's reply was swift, precise, and chilling. Then England has been negotiating with shadows. And shadows, Doctor, are far more dangerous than armies, because you cannot strike at what you cannot see. He rose, coat in hand. We go to the archives. The archives of the ministry were not the dust-laden labyrinths of popular imagination. They were efficient, well-guarded, and cold as a vault. Steel drawers lined the walls, each marked with a code rather than a title. Access required 2 keys, one for the official record and one for the unofficial ledger. It was to the latter that Mycroft guided me. He found the entry he sought, a shipping manifest dated 6 weeks earlier, the day before the minister embarked on a diplomatic visit to Paris. The manifest listed nothing unusual, save for one curious omission: the name of the courier. Instead, the space read simply, "By coat." Mycroft said nothing for a long moment, only let out a thin breath. "There is your answer," he murmured. The minister has been unwittingly transporting correspondence of the highest sensitivity. And now, he tapped the cipher sheet. Now they've grown bolder. They are no longer content to pass information. They are directing actions. But what kind of actions? Mycroft's gaze shifted toward me, almost reluctantly. The last 2 ciphers I have seen from this hand preceded political resignations, scandals that erupted overnight, the sudden recall of entire embassies. This one, he placed his palm flat upon it, may well herald something far worse. We left the archives with more questions than we had entered, but also with a grim certainty. This was no longer merely a matter of deciphering messages. It was a race against the clock. The streets outside were unchanged, vendors calling out, hansom cabs rattling over cobblestones, but they felt altered, as though each passerby might be watching us, each shadow concealing more than just the absence of light. I realized then that the title Ministry of Night was not poetic invention. It was a warning. And the coat was not simply a garment. It was a weapon. And somewhere in the city, the hand that had stitched that weapon was already moving again. Chapter 3. The coat that spoke in silence. It is an odd thing, dear listener, when an object, mute and still, appears to carry within it a voice that wishes to be heard. The minister's coat was such an object. It hung there, in the lamplight of Mycroft's sitting room, its dark wool gleaming faintly, like a sentry guarding a forbidden truth. Mycroft had laid it across a high-backed chair, not out of care for its owner, but because he regarded it as a puzzle, an artifact that demanded respect, not sentiment. The faint scent of tobacco clung to it, mingled with something sharper, perhaps ink or perhaps the ghost of a perfume now long faded. But there was more than scent. There was weight. Mycroft's mind, ever attuned to subtlety, noted the way the coat sagged oddly on one side, as if it bore a secret too heavy for its seams. He did not touch it immediately. That would have been too easy. Instead, he circled it like a barrister circling a hostile witness. Every crease, every thread, every faint mark in the fabric became a clue to be filed in that vast and meticulous library of his mind. "You are not merely a coat," he murmured, as though the garment might reply. "You are an accomplice." But before we speak of what Mycroft found, you must know how it came into his possession, and why it mattered. The coat had arrived in a brown paper parcel, sent from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with a note scrawled in haste. "For your immediate attention. Confidential. Return to Minister Ashford only upon your personal satisfaction of its integrity." No explanation. No signature. Just the cold stamp of officialdom. Therefore, Mycroft understood that the request was not mere courtesy. It was necessity. The minister was, by all accounts, a man of reputation but not of subtlety. If something had been placed in his possession without his knowledge, the consequences could range from diplomatic embarrassment to national catastrophe. Mycroft's long, pale fingers finally touched the lapel. He pressed it between thumb and forefinger, and at once felt a ridge, too deliberate to be a fault in the tailoring. His eyes narrowed. He ran his hands along the seam, not like a man checking the fit of a coat, but like a surgeon feeling for the edge of a tumor. Then came the moment of decision. A small pair of shears rested on the desk. Mycroft lifted them without hesitation and snipped the lining at the shoulder. There was no sound except the clean whisper of fabric yielding to steel. From the narrow cavity emerged a slip of vellum, folded into a tight triangle, precise, intentional, impossible to have fallen there by accident. He laid it flat on the desk, the lamplight catching its surface. Ink marks sprawled across it, but not in any language he recognized. They were symbols, curves, hooks, dots and slashes, arranged with an order that felt deliberate yet maddening. "A cipher," Mycroft said aloud, though there was no one to hear him. "And not a simple one." But with that thought came a deeper realization. Whoever had placed this within the minister's coat had done so without his knowledge, but with full expectation that the garment would be worn to certain meetings. Meetings where the wrong eyes, or the right eyes, depending on one's allegiance, might catch a glimpse of what was hidden. Therefore this was not merely a secret message. It was bait. Mycroft sat back in his chair, the slip of vellum lying before him like a sleeping serpent. The room seemed to grow colder. The fire, though crackling, gave no warmth. In the stillness, he heard the distant tolling of St. Paul's, 3 deep chimes that seemed to mark the hour not just of the night, but of the nation's fate. Somewhere in London, the person who placed this cipher in the minister's coat would be expecting a reaction. The question was, did they want it read or destroyed? And if it was read, by whom? He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, his gaze locked upon the inked symbols. They seemed almost to move under the light, as though aware they were being watched. Mycroft was not easily unsettled, but he knew when he was staring at the beginning of something vast, intricate, and perilous. The coat hung silent still, yet Mycroft knew it had spoken. And its voice was only the first whisper of a storm. Chapter 4. The Watcher on the Steps. The fog had thickened by the time Mycroft Holmes emerged from the minister's residence. A pale orange glow from the street lamps barely pierced the heavy curtain of mist, and the cobbles beneath his feet glistened faintly in the lamplight. It was an evening in which sound seemed to carry differently. Footsteps were swallowed whole, yet the faintest rustle of cloth or whisper of breath seemed amplified. Mycroft paused on the stone steps, one gloved hand resting upon the wrought iron railing, his eyes sweeping the street. There it was again, that faint pressure of presence. He had felt it inside the minister's house as well, an awareness like a sixth sense that eyes were following his every movement. Now, out here in the damp night air, it seemed more tangible. Somewhere close by, concealed by the fog and the silence, someone was watching him. Mycroft's nature was not that of an impulsive man. He was a strategist at heart. He did not spin around to search for the source. Instead, he descended the steps slowly, as though in no particular hurry, all the while measuring the narrow street and the dim outlines of the buildings. A cart stood abandoned by the curb, its driver nowhere to be seen. A thin figure moved in silhouette at the far end of the lane, too still to be casual, too careful to draw notice. Mycroft turned right, taking the route toward Whitehall. The footsteps followed, soft, careful yet persistent. Whoever this was, they had a professional's touch. The mist grew thicker as he walked, until even the lamplight turned to indistinct smears of gold. The buildings on either side leaned inward, their upper stories blotting out the faint sky. It was a perfect setting for an ambush. Near the corner of a narrow passageway, Mycroft paused beside a shop window darkened for the night. In the faint reflection, he saw movement, a shadow pausing when he paused, melting against the wall. The game was set. He stepped into the narrow alley without looking back. The passage was barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast, with damp bricks on either side and a thread of gutter water running along the center. Halfway down he stopped. "You may as well come forward," Mycroft said, his voice calm but edged with authority. "Following me through London fog will achieve little unless you intend to introduce yourself." For a moment nothing stirred. Then, from the mist behind, the shadow detached itself from the wall and resolved into a man, thin, sharp-faced. His coat collar pulled high, a cap drawn low. His eyes glittered with a guarded intelligence. "You're quick to notice," the stranger said quietly. His accent was faintly foreign, Eastern European, Mycroft guessed. "I make it my business to notice," Mycroft replied. "Now, why are you following me?" The man hesitated, then stepped closer, stopping just beyond arm's reach. "You are Holmes," he said, "brother of the one they call the great detective. You are also the only man in this city who can read the thing you have taken from the minister's coat." Mycroft's expression did not change. "That is an interesting claim. You must then know what it is." The stranger's gaze flickered. "I know enough to be certain that if it is not in the right hands soon, many will die." The words were delivered without drama, but the weight in them was unmistakable. "Whose hands are the right hands?" Mycroft asked. "Was, then, not the minister's, and not yours, unless you are willing to act against your own government." That was bold. Too bold for an ordinary tale. This was a man who believed himself to have leverage. Mycroft, however, was not so easily manipulated. "Names," Mycroft said softly. "If you are to make such a claim, you will give me names." The stranger's lips tightened. "I will give you only this. There is a cipher in that coat, and it points to a meeting. The meeting is in 4 nights' time. If the wrong men are there, London will bleed." And with that, the man stepped backward into the fog. Mycroft did not follow. He knew the type, trained to vanish, and prepared for this moment long before they spoke. In seconds, the footsteps faded into nothing, leaving only the steady drip of water in the gutter. Standing alone in the misted alley, Mycroft considered the words. Cipher. Meeting. A warning delivered in a shadowed passage by a man whose loyalties were not yet known. The puzzle had shifted from a matter of curiosity to one of urgency, and Mycroft Holmes, ever the strategist, understood that when the board changes, so too must the player's position. He stepped back into the main street, already calculating his next move. The fog closed around him like a curtain, and the watcher, whether friend, foe, or something in between, was gone. Chapter 5. The Man in the Umbrella Shop. The following afternoon was grey, with a drizzle fine enough to bead the cobblestones of Pall Mall in a shimmering gloss. Mycroft, never one to be deterred by weather, left his club precisely at 2 o'clock and took a hansom cab towards a rather unassuming shop on a narrow side street, Pemberton's Umbrella Emporium. To any casual passer-by, it was merely a purveyor of walking sticks, rain shades, and the occasional travel trunk. But to those in the know, it was something more, a place where certain gentlemen in the service of the Crown conducted their business under the guise of discussing the merits of silk canopies versus whalebone frames. The cab deposited Mycroft at the curb, and he stepped down, the brim of his bowler shielding his eyes from the drizzle. He paused a moment outside the shop window. Inside, a solitary figure stood at the counter, speaking in a low voice to the proprietor, a man in a dark coat, carrying himself with the caution of one accustomed to watching shadows. Mycroft entered, the bell above the door chiming softly. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of varnish and damp wool. Mr. Pemberton, a lean man with thinning hair and a mustache like two thin commas, looked up immediately and gave Mycroft a knowing nod. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes," he said, voice neutral but tinged with a subtle recognition. The other customer turned slightly, revealing a narrow face and eyes that missed nothing. He was perhaps in his early 40s, with a certain weary elegance in his manner. Mycroft knew the type well, a man who had seen much, perhaps too much, yet still moved through the world with a deliberate quiet. "This is Mr. Carraway," Pemberton said, making the introduction with the ease of someone who understood the unspoken rules of discretion. Mycroft inclined his head. "I believe you were in the company of Minister Harrington the evening before last." Carraway's expression flickered, not surprise exactly, but a measured calculation. "Indeed. Though I suspect, Mr. Holmes, that you already know more than I could tell you." "Perhaps," Mycroft said mildly, "but I prefer to hear matters from the source. You were the last person to see Harrington before he returned to his club. And now the coat he wore contains an item of considerable interest." Carraway hesitated, glancing at Pemberton. The shopkeeper, without a word, moved to the far end of the store and began rearranging walking sticks, giving them privacy. Leaning slightly towards Mycroft, Carraway spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "It is possible, Mr. Holmes, that the coat you speak of carried more than a man's warmth. The minister had recently come into possession of a cipher, a series of numbers, simple at first glance, but coded in a way only a certain few could interpret. He was unsettled about it. He claimed it was given to him by an attaché from the Eastern Bloc, though he would not say why." "And this attaché's name?" Mycroft asked, his tone as calm as still water. "That," Carraway said with a faint smile, "is the one thing he refused to tell me. He feared that even speaking it might draw attention. But I can tell you this. Harrington believed the cipher was connected to a pending treaty, one that, if compromised, would shift the balance of certain maritime territories." Mycroft's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. "Then it is not merely an idle curiosity." It is a lever. Caraway gave a small nod. Precisely. A moment of silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint patter of rain against the window. And now, Mycroft said quietly, the minister is missing. This time Caraway's composure cracked. His lips pressed thin and he looked away. That, I did not know. But it explains why you are here. It explains a great deal, Mycroft replied. Tell me, did Harrington seem troubled? Nervous? Was anyone following him? Caraway's answer was slow in coming. He was not nervous. He was resigned. As though he had stepped onto a path he could no longer leave. I walked with him only as far as Charing Cross. There he hailed a cab, and I saw him no more. Mycroft studied the man for a long moment, the silence heavy with calculation. Then he said, Mr. Caraway, if you should recall anything, a name, a face, even the color of a flower in a lapel, send word to me immediately. Caraway inclined his head in agreement. I will. They parted with the barest nods, and Mycroft stepped back into the damp street. The drizzle had grown heavier, and a cold wind threaded through the narrow lane. But Mycroft's thoughts were not on the weather. They were on the peculiar mixture of resignation and secrecy in Caraway's account. Back at the corner he paused, pulling his coat tighter. The cipher was clearly no trivial matter. If the minister had hidden it in his coat and then vanished, the danger was not merely personal. It was political and perhaps international. And somewhere, in the grey hush of the London afternoon, Mycroft felt the invisible clockwork of the city ticking with unusual urgency. Chapter 6. The Hidden Code. The next morning dawned with a reluctant sun, pale and cold, casting only the weakest warmth upon the frost-covered cobblestones of Whitehall. I arrived early at Mycroft Holmes's residence, finding him already seated at his writing desk, the remnants of breakfast pushed aside and the minister's coat laid out neatly before him like a body on an autopsy table. He was not reading a newspaper as I had expected, but a thick volume on the history of cryptographic ciphers, a finger marking a particular page while his other hand tapped the table in a steady rhythm. Ah, Lestrade, he said without lifting his gaze. You're early. But the sooner we begin, the fewer people will have the chance to misinterpret our progress, or interfere with it. I drew closer, my eyes falling upon the coat. Its once pristine fabric was now slightly creased from Mycroft's careful handling. He gestured for me to take a seat and then, without ceremony, picked up a small magnifying glass. You see here, he said, indicating the inner seam of the left sleeve, a pattern of thread that differs from the manufacturer's standard stitch. This is not a repair. This is intentional. I leaned in, squinting at the subtle irregularities. Indeed, some of the stitches seemed ever so slightly longer, others shorter, forming, when one's mind adjusted, a sequence. It's Morse code, I breathed. Precisely, Mycroft replied. Dots and dashes formed not with ink or chisel, but with thread. The elegance of it was startling. A diplomat's coat, worn openly at high-level meetings, yet carrying a message hidden in plain sight. Mycroft, however, was not content with the obvious. He was already sketching the sequence onto paper, translating the stitches into dots and dashes, then into letters. After several minutes, he sat back, brows furrowed. The message reads, Key in lining, cabinet 14. He frowned. Key. What kind of key? And cabinet where? That, Lestrade, is the question. The word lining suggests that we have not yet exhausted the coat's secrets. As for cabinet 14, it is not a term used in the Foreign Office. My suspicion is that it refers to a location rather than a piece of furniture. He reached for a small, curved blade and began to work along the inner lining of the coat with surgeon-like precision. A faint rustle of hidden paper met our ears. Mycroft withdrew a tiny envelope, no larger than a matchbox, sealed with black wax bearing a symbol I did not recognize, a double-headed eagle clutching a sword. "Ah," he murmured. "Our friends from the East." "You mean Russia?" asked my voice low. "Indeed. This is the mark of a certain faction within their intelligence apparatus. Not the official Tsarist service, but a splinter group, more dangerous for their lack of accountability." He broke the seal carefully. Inside was a small brass key, no larger than my thumb, engraved with the number 14. "Cabinet 14, I repeated slowly. "Exactly," Mycroft said. "This could refer to a numbered storage compartment, a diplomatic mail drawer, or even a concealed archive in a foreign embassy. Whatever the case, the possession of this key by the late minister suggests that he was carrying something, quite literally, for another party. And now that something is missing." Before we could dwell further, a sharp rap sounded at the door. Mycroft slid the key into his waistcoat pocket and covered the coat with a folded newspaper before calling out, "Enter." It was a young clerk from the Foreign Office, pale and nervous. He glanced between us before producing an envelope marked urgent. Mycroft took it with deliberate slowness, dismissing the man without a word. Breaking the seal, he scanned the letter. His expression shifted, not with surprise, but with the satisfaction of a man whose suspicions had just been confirmed. "The minister's death," he said, "was no mere accident. According to this report, he was last seen at a discreet dining establishment known to host certain unofficial diplomatic meetings. Witnesses recall he left abruptly, claiming he had forgotten something important in his coat. Moments later, he collapsed in the street." "Poison?" "Yes." "Almost certainly," Mycroft said, folding the letter. "But the manner is curious. Quick enough to silence him, yet not before he could attempt to retrieve or hide something. The placement of the cipher within the stitching tells me this was prepared well in advance. The assassin knew the coat contained more than warmth." We sat in silence for a moment, the faint ticking of the mantel clock filling the room. Mycroft's mind was clearly moving several steps ahead. "Lestrade," he said finally, "you will accompany me this afternoon to a certain warehouse on the east side of the Thames. It is operated under a neutral flag, but it is in fact a hub for covert exchanges between various governments. If my reading of the cipher is correct, Cabinet 14 will be there. And within it, the missing piece of this puzzle." I felt a shiver of both anticipation and unease. "And if the people who put it there are expecting us? Then," Mycroft said, slipping on his gloves, "we must be prepared for diplomacy of a rather less official variety." The day moved with a deliberate heaviness, as though London itself sensed the tension of what was to come. By the time we made our way toward the warehouse in Mycroft's carriage, the streets had thinned of ordinary passers-by, replaced by those whose eyes lingered too long and whose pace was too measured. The warehouse loomed ahead, a nondescript brick structure with a flag fluttering above it that belonged to no real country. Mycroft stepped down first, his expression unreadable, and led the way inside. We were greeted not by clerks, but by two broad-shouldered men in plain coats, their gazes as sharp as bayonets. A brief exchange of words, low, clipped, and entirely without warmth, passed between Mycroft and one of them before we were waved through to a back corridor lined with identical locked cabinets. There midway down stood Cabinet 14. Mycroft produced the brass key, its metal catching the dim light. He slid it into the lock, turned it, and with a soft click, the door opened. Inside was a single sealed leather folder bearing the crest of the British Foreign Office, and beneath it, A smaller envelope marked in Cyrillic script. Mycroft reached for the folder first, then paused. "We must not open these here," he said quietly. "Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." He locked the cabinet once more, key in hand, and turned to leave. But as we stepped back into the corridor, a shadow fell across the doorway. 3 men stood there, none of them smiling. Chapter 7: Whispers in the Gallery. The following morning broke with a thin layer of frost over the streets of Westminster, giving the entire district an austere, glassy sheen. Mycroft Holmes, though not often one for morning excursions, found himself walking briskly along Whitehall. His overcoat buttoned to the chin and his umbrella serving more as a walking stick than a shield against the pale winter sun. The clock above the Treasury building had not yet struck 10, but the government quarter was already alive with purpose. Messengers scurried along the pavements, their boots snapping on the frozen stones, while hansom cabs clattered in measured rhythm. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp wool. His destination was not the minister's office, that would come later, but the members' gallery of the House of Commons. It was here, in the echoing corridors and draughty antechambers, that the true pulse of Westminster could be felt. Gossip, Mycroft often remarked, was the lifeblood of politics, and gossip tended to collect in the gallery like dust in an unused room. Upon entering, he was greeted by Mr. Algernon West, a balding man of quick eyes and quicker speech, who served as a clerk to several senior members. "Holmes, I was told you'd be about this morning," West said in a low voice, his tone halfway between welcome and caution. "Then perhaps you might also tell me what else you've heard," Mycroft replied, slipping his gloves into his pocket. West hesitated, glancing at the handful of members pacing the long hallway. "Not here. There's an empty gallery above the reading room. Follow me." They ascended a narrow staircase to a chamber with high windows that looked out over the Thames. From here, the muffled drone of debates below could be heard, a sound like bees humming behind a thick wall. West lowered his voice further. "The talk among the members is that Minister Caraway has enemies far closer than he suspects. Some say he is to be undermined before the session's end. Others whisper, well, that there are documents missing from the Foreign Office." "Missing," Mycroft repeated, his tone not inquisitive so much as evaluative. "Sensitive documents. The sort that, if read aloud in certain quarters, might undo months of delicate negotiation with our Eastern partners." Mycroft allowed the silence to stretch, letting West feel the weight of what he had said. "And where does the cipher fit into this gossip?" Mycroft asked finally. West gave a startled look. "Cipher? I've heard nothing of one. But there was a curious remark last night in the members' dining room. A junior member from Sussex claimed he had seen Caraway's coat in the cloakroom after the sitting, and that it had been searched. Not by the attendants, mind you, but by another member." The corners of Mycroft's mouth moved in what might almost have been a smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "Did he name this enterprising colleague?" "No. Said it was someone in evening dress, tall, with a limp. That's all." The information, scant as it was, threaded neatly into the growing tapestry in Mycroft's mind. A limp, a late-night search, and a minister who carried a cipher in his coat, a cipher he may not have even understood. The sequence suggested both haste and desperation. He left West with a brief nod, descending once more into the main gallery. This time he did not linger. His next step was the cloakroom itself, a long, dim space lined with pegs and heavy wool coats, smelling of leather, tobacco, and old rain. The attendant on duty was a stooped man with a kindly face, who seemed unsurprised to see the famous government advisor. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Haven't seen you in here for months." I rarely come without purpose, Mycroft said. Tell me, were you here at the close of the session last night? I was, sir. A long night it was too. Members coming and going, some leaving their coats, others not. Do you recall anyone handling Minister Caraway's coat? The attendant frowned in thought. Not handling it exactly, but I did notice it was taken down twice in quick succession. First by the minister himself. He was heading out, then got called back to speak to Lord Fanshawe. Then a minute later, a gentleman took it down again, looked inside the pockets and hung it back. Describe him. The attendant's brow furrowed. Tall fellow, dark hair going grey at the temples, dressed formal-like. Had a bit of a limp on his left leg. Didn't seem like he was stealing anything. Just checking, like he was looking for something that should be there but wasn't. And you didn't challenge him? The man shook his head. I thought he was one of the minister's aides. No harm done, I reckoned. No harm yet. Mycroft thanked the man and left, his mind already shifting through names. There were only a handful of men of that description in the political sphere, and fewer still who would dare handle a minister's coat in a public cloakroom. As he stepped out into the cold air, he paused at the sight of the river. The Thames, brown and sluggish under the winter light, reflected the tall chimneys and stone parapets in a wavering blur. Somewhere out there the Cipher's purpose and its danger awaited discovery. For now, Mycroft had confirmed one thing beyond doubt. Someone in Parliament knew of the Cipher's existence, and that someone was moving against the minister. Whether this was to protect the realm or to endanger it, that question, he knew, would define the entire course of his investigation. The bells of St. Margaret's struck the half-hour. Mycroft turned toward the Foreign Office, his pace slow, deliberate. There were conversations yet to have, quiet ones, in small rooms where whispers could be weighed and traded like coin. And there was a certain tall gentleman with a limp who had just risen to the top of his list. Chapter 8. The Man in the Fog. London was no stranger to fog, but on that evening it seemed as if the city itself conspired to conceal the truth. The gas lamps struggled to pierce the heavy mist, their halos of light barely touching the slick cobblestones. Footsteps echoed faintly, distorted by the damp air, and every shadow seemed an intruder. It was under such conditions that Mycroft Holmes took his calculated walk from the Diogenes Club to the appointed meeting place. The Cipher had yielded a fragment of its secret, enough to confirm that a clandestine handoff had been arranged that night. The sender, it seemed, had a peculiar habit of choosing locations where the city muffled its own voice, and the fog served as both veil and confidant. He arrived precisely 3 minutes early. Mycroft had always believed that punctuality was the foundation upon which all intelligence work rested. Not arriving before time, for that drew suspicion, and never late, for that ceded the advantage to others. Standing at the mouth of a narrow lane in the dockside quarter, he drew his overcoat tighter and allowed his mind to settle into its usual state of quiet vigilance. The first figure emerged from the fog like a smudge on canvas, a tall man with a stoop, his gait marked by the careful tread of one accustomed to evasion. He glanced behind him twice before stepping under the faint glow of the nearest lamp. Mycroft did not move. From the opposite direction came another, a stockier man, hands buried in his pockets, hat pulled low. He passed within feet of Mycroft without meeting his eyes. The faintest trace of cologne clung to him, sharp and foreign. Mycroft filed it away in the ledger of his mind. But it was the third man who commanded his attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and draped in a long coat of fine wool, he moved with the confidence of someone who believed himself unseen. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but as he drew closer, Mycroft caught the gleam of a signet ring, an insignia he had last encountered during a matter of Balkan intrigue 3 years prior. The three men converged a dozen yards ahead, their forms indistinct in the mist. Mycroft shifted position, the better to observe without intrusion. A parcel changed hands, small enough to fit into a coat pocket, yet exchanged with the gravity of state secrets. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. The tall man with the signet ring noticed him first. Their eyes met, just for a second, but in that second Mycroft read an entire chapter of the man's mind. Alarm, calculation, and the dawning recognition that his errand had been observed by a mind not easily deceived. Before Mycroft could close the distance, the fog swallowed them. Footsteps quickened, turning into the hollow thud of a retreat. Mycroft gave chase for 6 strides before pausing. He knew the futility of pursuing men who had already plotted their escape routes. Instead, he crouched where they had stood and examined the ground. The damp cobbles yielded their secrets reluctantly, but he found what he sought, a scrap of coarse paper, perhaps torn in haste. It bore faint marks, written in a hurried hand, and a single numeral, 7. Not a number by chance. In the ciphered document he had partially decoded earlier that day, the 7th line had been left conspicuously blank. Now, the scrap seemed to point directly toward whatever had been concealed there. A sound, light, deliberate, made him look up. The tall man with the signet ring was watching him from the far end of the lane, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. For a heartbeat, the man stood perfectly still, as though committing Mycroft's silhouette to memory. Then, with a faint tip of his hat, he turned and vanished into the fog. The gesture was not one of courtesy. It was a warning. Mycroft had been noticed, measured, and found worthy of caution. Returning to Pall Mall, Mycroft felt the familiar quiet thrill of progress mixed with the sobering weight of consequence. Whoever the man in the fog was, he was no petty courier. The exchange had not been mere contraband or casual corruption. The scrap of paper in Mycroft's pocket was the fragment of a larger design, one whose pattern was beginning to emerge. And in that pattern, Mycroft knew, the cipher in the minister's coat was only the opening move. Chapter 9. The Quiet Interception. The night was a dark velvet curtain, stitched with faint stars that peered through the London mist. Mycroft Holmes sat alone in the back of a closed cab, the dim yellow light of a street lamp briefly illuminating his face each time they passed under one. He looked outward, though his eyes seemed fixed upon nothing in particular, his mind far from the physical streets rushing by. In his hand, folded neatly but without its usual precision, was a telegram. The message had been brief, far too brief for the gravity of its implications. A certain Minister of Trade, believed to be unconnected to the cipher matter, had sent a late-night request for Mycroft to meet him at his private club on Pall Mall. The summons was unusual, and the hour, past 11, made it clear that the matter was urgent, though perhaps not entirely above suspicion. Mycroft, who trusted coincidence only slightly more than he trusted chaos, had not ignored the feeling that he was being maneuvered. The cab slowed to a halt outside the quiet façade of the club. There was no welcoming doorman, no movement behind the lace curtains of the windows. Mycroft stepped out, paid the driver, and stood still for a long moment on the cobblestones, listening. The night air carried the faint scent of rain and coal smoke, and the city's usual rumble seemed oddly muted. He mounted the steps with the deliberate pace of a man approaching a chessboard rather than a building. Inside, the club was dark except for a single reading lamp in the far corner of the lounge. A solitary figure sat there, half in shadow. "Lord Addington," Mycroft greeted in his calm, level tone. "You requested my presence." The older man looked up, his eyes shifting quickly toward the door before returning to Mycroft. "Holmes, I trust you came alone." His voice trembled slightly, not from age, Mycroft suspected, but from a mind struggling to maintain composure. "I did," Mycroft replied, his eyes moving to the sideboard. Two untouched glasses stood there, and beside them an envelope with a dark seal. Lord Addington motioned for Mycroft to sit, but before he could speak further, the door behind them creaked. Mycroft's gaze sharpened, his mind calculating distances, exits, and the precise weight of the brass letter opener on the table. A tall man entered, dressed in the style of a government courier, dark coat, bowler hat in hand. He nodded politely. "Sir, I was instructed to deliver this," he said, producing a folded document from his coat pocket. His eyes flicked toward Mycroft for the briefest instant, then back to the minister. Addington reached out, but Mycroft's voice cut in, smooth but firm. "One moment. Who gave you these instructions?" The courier hesitated. "The instruction came, indirectly, sir. From the Foreign Office." "Indirectly," Mycroft repeated. "Which means you did not receive it from the Foreign Office yourself." The man said nothing. Mycroft rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow in the lamplight. "Place the document on the table. Step back." There was a moment of quiet resistance, then the courier complied. Mycroft's eyes narrowed as he noted the faint discoloration along the document's fold, an almost invisible residue of something applied recently. "Addington," Mycroft said without looking away from the paper, "I must ask you not to touch this." "Not yet." He reached into his inner coat pocket and produced a small silk handkerchief. With deliberate care, he lifted the paper and sniffed faintly near the edge. His brows tightened. "Chloroform," he murmured. "Enough to dull the senses without alerting the victim." Addington's face paled. "So the meeting was orchestrated," Mycroft finished for him. "And this document, whether genuine or not, was meant to ensure that you would be in no state to object should it be taken from you afterward." The courier's hand twitched slightly toward his pocket. Mycroft, without turning, said in a voice as cold as the Thames in winter, "If your fingers close upon the revolver in your coat, you will find that the letter opener beside me is considerably quicker than your draw." The man froze. Addington, regaining a measure of composure, asked quietly, "Holmes, what is this about?" "The cipher," Mycroft replied simply. "You possess a copy, perhaps unknowingly, that certain individuals are prepared to obtain by any means. That coat you wore during last week's parliamentary session, the one you sent to be brushed and pressed, was searched. Not by your valet, but by an intruder who believed you had concealed something in its lining." The minister's lips parted in astonishment. "The tailor," he mentioned a slight tear. "I thought nothing of it." "Indeed. But our adversaries think of everything." The courier swallowed, his eyes darting to the door. Mycroft stepped forward, his voice now almost conversational. "You will carry a message back to your employers. Tell them that the minister's coat is now in the possession of the British government's most unyielding custodian. And tell them," his gaze hardened, "that I am no longer merely observing their little game. I am now playing." The courier, sensing the dismissal, departed quickly, leaving the lamp-lit room heavy with silence. Addington's voice was low. "Holmes, you said adversaries. Plural?" Mycroft folded the silk handkerchief and tucked it away. "Yes. I fear this cipher is not the interest of a single nation. We are on the verge of a contest far larger than you yet realize. And the first move was made tonight, under the guise of a quiet meeting." He glanced at the dark windows, as though seeing beyond London into the shadowy corridors of foreign ministries and secret bureaus. The next move, however, will be mine. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. The morning that followed was unseasonably bright, as though London itself sought to wash away the shadows of the past week. Yet, within the quiet confines of my study, the air still held a weight, the residue of a mystery only just resolved. Mycroft Holmes sat in the armchair opposite, his hands steepled, his expression not one of triumph but of contemplation. "It is a strange thing, Lestrade," he began, his tone deliberate, "how the gravest of matters often rest upon the smallest of oversights." I nodded, recalling the events that had unfolded the night before. The cipher, painstakingly hidden within the stitching of the minister's coat, had been extracted and decoded under Mycroft's careful eye. What it revealed was no simple collection of words or names, but rather a sequence, times, dates, and locations of clandestine meetings between certain members of the diplomatic corps and an agent of a foreign power. The gravity was clear. Each entry, had it been acted upon, could have shifted negotiations, moved borders, or even sparked conflict. "But what of Cartwright?" I asked quietly. The minister's long-trusted secretary had been taken away by the Yard only hours earlier. His face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line of defeat. "A man of habits," Mycroft replied. "Habits are the most telling of human traits." It was not the cipher itself that betrayed him to me, but rather the fact that he always brushed his sleeve before leaving a room. A small tick, seemingly harmless, until I noticed it coincided with his opportunities to transfer or receive the coat from its usual place in the minister's study. The explanation, as always with Mycroft, was simple only in hindsight. The coat's regular brushing had allowed Cartwright to conceal his tampering beneath the guise of tidiness, ensuring the secret remained hidden for months. "You knew before we even found the cipher," I said slowly. "I suspected," Mycroft corrected. "One should never confuse suspicion with certainty. The difference lies in evidence, and evidence, Lestrade, requires patience." Outside, the clatter of carriage wheels drifted up from Whitehall, mingling with the rhythmic toll of the Abbey's bells. The sound brought an odd comfort. Life in London would continue, unaware of how close it had come to disruption. Mycroft rose from his chair and crossed to the mantel, where the minister's coat now hung neatly on a brass hook. Without ceremony, he took it down, running his fingers along the lining where the tiny cipher had once been hidden. His touch was almost respectful, as though acknowledging a worthy opponent. "There will be no public trial," he said at last. "These matters seldom end in the courts. The Prime Minister will see to it that Cartwright is dealt with quietly, and the Minister himself will be told that his coat, once an instrument of betrayal, is now nothing more than a garment." I could not help but feel a pang of sympathy for the minister, a man caught in a web spun so close to his person that he had failed to notice it until it was almost too late. Mycroft, however, seemed untouched by sentiment. "In truth," he continued, "this was never about the minister. He was merely the unwitting custodian of the cipher. The real battle was between those who sought to control the course of our diplomacy and those charged with defending it. And you," I said, "were the deciding factor." He gave a faint smile, though it did not reach his eyes. "No, Lestrade. The deciding factor was observation. Observation and the understanding that in human affairs, it is the coat one must watch, not the man wearing it." We sat in silence for a moment, the fire casting soft shadows across the room. Then Mycroft turned towards me, his gaze sharper now. "There will be more of these," he said. "More ciphers, more quiet attempts to alter the balance of power. I am not so naive as to believe this is the last." "Then what will you do?" Yes. What I always do, he replied, reaching for his hat and gloves. I will watch, I will listen, and when the threads begin to tangle, I will be there to untie them. He stepped to the door, but paused with his hand on the frame. And you, Lestrade, remember this case. Not for the cipher, nor for the coat, but for the fact that the most dangerous secrets are often those hiding in plain sight. With that, he was gone, leaving only the faint echo of his steps in the corridor. I remained by the fire for a long while after, the events of the past days replaying in my mind. The minister's relieved handshake, the quiet arrest of Cartwright, the meticulous unraveling of the code, each detail a part of the larger whole, now neatly tied off by Mycroft's unerring logic. Outside, the city carried on, unaware, untroubled, and perhaps that was as it should be. But I knew, as surely as Mycroft did, that somewhere in its winding streets, another cipher was already being written. Thank you for joining me for tonight's tale. And so I leave you with a question. If you held a key to a secret that could unmask a powerful man, yet shatter the life of someone you cherish, would you turn it?